and knowledge sharing, and professional educational experiences. Our most recent activities were our spring technical workshop in Albuquerque in March, followed by an international energy systems integration workshop in London the next week. Our next activity will be the meteorology and markets workshop in Denver in June. These workshops deal with a full range of issues associated with integrating wind and solar into electric, gas, and thermal systems. They also deal with the coupling to energy consuming infrastructures, especially electric transportation, buildings, and industry. Registration is open for the upcoming June workshop in Denver, and everyone is welcome and invited to attend. ESIG is a very unique organization, and I don't think you'll find anything quite like it anywhere else in the world. If you're new to ESIG, I strongly encourage you to follow up with us if you like what you hear, and I think you'll be pleasantly surprised. You can find more about ESIG on the web at www.esig.energy, as well as on social media via LinkedIn, Facebook, and Twitter. Okay, just a few logistical matters before we get started. First of all, phones will be muted for the duration of the webinar to avoid any unnecessary distractions. So please use the question and answer box on the lower right side of your screen to submit questions. And we'll save 10 minutes or so at the end of the webinar for Q&A. We plan to wrap it up at the top of the hour, actually the bottom of the hour, and an email with a link will be provided once the presentation and audio file have been posted. We also plan to provide short responses to any unanswered questions after the webinar, so please don't be afraid to use the Q&A box. Okay. So today's webinar is on the topic of interaction between transmission and distribution planning with DER deployment. I see a lot of interest in T&D system impacts with DER out there, and I also see lots of questions on just how quickly it's going to happen. At the end of the webinar today, my hope is that everyone will be a little better informed and have a little better sense of the opportunity before us with DER deployment on distribution systems and their impact on the transmission system. This webinar will feature Eamonn Lannoye and Jans Bamer from EPRI, and Mathilde Lallemand and Herta de Jong from ENTSO-E. Eamonn is a senior project manager at EPRI, focusing on renewables and DER integration. Jans is a principal technical leader in the Transmission Operations and Planning Group at EPRI. Mathilde is working at ENTSO-E as a team lead for the TSO-DSO interface and digital strategy, and she previously worked for RTE in France. Herta de Jong is working at ENTSO-E also, but as a market advisor, with her main focus on market design, the TSO-DSO interface, and distributed system flexibility. Herta is on loan to ENTSO-E from the Dutch TSO tenant. I feel very fortunate to have these four presenters here with us today. Eamonn and Jans are both active participants in ESIG events, and we're hoping that Mathilde and Herta will soon be as well. I'm looking forward to what they all have to say on the webinar today. The webinar will discuss the question on how to transition a power system to reliably, effectively, and efficiently operate in a future with increasingly high levels of DER deployment and prosumers. The interaction between transmission systems and distribution networks is one of the critical junctures in this evolution. And the way planning and operation happens across the interface is evolving very rapidly. In this webinar, teams from EPRI and ENTSO-E will share their collected insights from Europe and North America on the promises and challenges of improving coordination across the transmission and distribution divide. Okay, without any further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Eamonn, I will now turn it over to you. Can you please take over with your presentation?
Yes, thanks very much, Jay, and welcome to everybody who's joining the webinar. It's great to have a chance to be able to share this work with you. As Jay said, I'm from EPRI, where I work in the grid operations and grid planning area. We've obviously been tracking the issue or the evolution of the system for quite a while to understand how distributed energy resources will affect how we understand the grid to operate and to plan for that as kind of prudent planners, and make sure that the R&D is there to provide the tools and insights that planners and then ultimately operators will need to be able to run the system in future. Over the last 3 or 4 years, the issue of the divide between transmission and distribution becoming less maybe clear with the advent of DER onto distribution systems, providing value and impacts on both the distribution networks to which they're immediately connected, the transmission networks to which those distribution networks are connected, and the markets in which generation which is used to balance the system. So we've been working together collaboratively between ENTSO-E, the European Network of Transmission System Operators, and here at EPRI to try and make sure that we're staying coordinated across the areas that we have activities in Europe, in North America, in Asia, and in Oceania on this topic. So we're hoping today to bring some insights from that and provide some thoughts for you maybe as you go about your business. So we're going to split it up into a couple of different sections. Just initially to talk through the introduction, I'll do that myself, and then Mathilde and Gerda will talk about some recent work that's been done in Europe that's of great relevance anywhere that there's DER coming. Activity there that's mostly looking at how the system will operate, which obviously has a lot of impact on how we think about how the system should be planned. So then when we move on to Jens towards the later part of the webcast, we'll look at then the planning implications, what the activities are underway to plan for a tighter coupling between transmission and distribution and how those challenges can be overcome. There'll be lots of time for Q&A, and we're really hoping to make this useful for you, and we know that the easiest way for us all to do that is for you to tell us what's useful for you. So please use the Q&A box if you can find it. If you can't use it, use a chat, whatever way, just send us the messages and we'll be happy, Jay's watching, as he said, to pass those through to us. So just to start off at a fairly high level, this is probably not news to most of you, but just the changing nature of the grid means not just that there's solar panels on people's roofs now, and that there's a risk of backfeed into the system or whatever else. It's that the whole system, both transmission level and distribution level, is kind of changing in how we think about the system as a whole. The centralized to decentralized is one part of it, one part of that thinking, but really the big step that we have to make is not just dealing with DER, it's how to make a system that best operates when you've got a lot of DER. And that means communications across the transmission distribution boundary, not just between somebody and a DER owner to make sure that they've got the right settings, but actual real genuine dialogue on things that have never been talked about before in much detail between distribution service providers, transmission service providers, balancing authorities, RCs, all having to know a little bit more about how everybody else works around them so that we can all make decisions that work for the whole system, as well as to make sure that everybody gets their job done. So we're looking to try and understand through our integrated grid initiative that EPRI did a couple of years ago, some of you might be familiar with it. How do we work towards that system that's flexible, that's resilient, that's connected, that's able to kind of fairly seamlessly move between a more centralized way of thinking to a decentralized way of thinking, depending on system conditions? And how do we untap the value and manage the impacts of that kind of different way of operating a system, and by extension, how to plan for that? So that's where our thinking has come from. Initially, there's plenty of information available on that one through the integratedgrid.com website, and we're tracking there where pilots are happening to try and start to work towards that goal. So specifically though, we want to focus on the issue of where decisions have to be made, or in the operational domain or in the planning domain, or even in between the two, How do transmission utilities, distribution utilities, balancing authorities, how do they evolve their work processes? How do they understand which tools they need to be able to make decisions in now and into the future? And as a result, what data might they need that they don't currently have? So we have here an F32 Parallel Efforts underway. One is through the Department of Energy that we held some workshops over the last year or two and are currently putting the final touches on a report that summarizes all of the things that need to be done on a day-to-day basis to plan and operate a power system from a transmission point of view and from a distribution point of view, to look at how those things, how the system is evolving in terms of DER penetration, more active consumers, and what does that mean for those things that we're trying to get done? How do we make sure that the system remains reliable? How do we make sure it remains economic? And looking at those tools that are required and the data that will be required, and actually trying to track where that data comes from. So is it something that would naturally reside within a distribution utility, or is there something now that's needed from the transmission side because of the changing system? More often than not, it happens to be that the transmission side of things needs to know more about what's located on the distribution network, maybe not because they want to know exactly how the distribution network operates on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, but just so that we can build a fair enough representation of what's happening on the distribution system to inform transmission. But that data has to flow, that insight has to flow, and that's what we're tracking with that project, which is almost ready for publication. And once we have that done, we'll be happy to share results. Similarly, and building on some work that Gerda and Mathilde had done earlier in Europe, we're working on the specific issues to do with the European system, the market design and system operations there, a little bit different from maybe an ISO area in the US, which is again a little bit different from how operations and planning works at an integrated utility. So there's some regional specific issues that we're working with the group of stakeholders to try and understand what tools are needed, where the data comes from, on what kind of priority basis should that data be collected, and try to give people an understanding of where that data is going. So the justification for somebody making a request is grounded in some truth. So that's two things that we're working on at EPRI, both coming to fruition at the moment. The DoE project, as we said, pretty near to completion. Broadly speaking, and there's a typo on this one, so sorry about that, it should say dispatch, but broadly speaking, the main emphasis in the effort around transmission and distribution utility coordination is coming down to a couple of key tasks in the first round. Not to say that there's not other things that need to be done, but that initially things like investing in metering infrastructure, investing in grid infrastructure, investing in the type of inverters on DER that make sure that the whole system operates together in a safe, secure, reliable way, is the kind of the largest effort that's going on in the planning time frame in the US, as it is in Europe, as it is elsewhere. Similarly, then when you get into both the planning time frame and the operational time frame, forecasting how the system is going to evolve in terms of both adoption of DER and in operational sense, the outputs of production, the availability from DER, such that the transmission system provider can get a better view of how things might operate from a balancing authority point of view. But also there's many other things that need to be considered now. Voltage control in operations is becoming maybe a little bit of a different challenge to the one that it was before. And it's very much informed by what you think is going to happen with DER. So operational forecasting is really one big area. And then dispatch and ancillary services, economic commitment and economic dispatch and ancillary services, actually bringing those DER into the system is something that many of you will be aware in the US in particular, having a great deal of traction through FERC Order 841 the DER workshops and the potential rulemaking. So we see a very large flurry of activity there, where everybody's trying to scramble together to try and piece together different parts of the interface between transmission and distribution. There is some logic to be had to how to go about that. So there are priorities in terms of things that need to be dealt with, and that's kind of a little bit different in each region, but broadly speaking, they come down to these three topics right now. So I'm just going to hand off to Mathilde, who's going to talk about in Europe how particularly one aspect or a couple of very tightly interrelated aspects of DER integration makes the TSO-DSO discussion there a little bit more real, a little bit more immediate. So Mathilde, I'll hand over to you to introduce the active system management work.
Hello everyone, so I'm Mathilde Lallemand, I work for ENTSO-E, and I'm going to talk about what we are doing at European level on TSO-DSO cooperation. What's very important to have in mind in Europe is that the situation in different countries is very different in terms of actors. Some countries, and especially in terms of DSOs, usually there is one TSO per country. Some countries have several, but usually there is one. But the number of DSOs is very diverse. Some countries may have one big DSO. Some countries may have hundreds of smaller DSOs, which makes the TSO-DSO dialogue extremely different from one country to another. And in the last 2 years and even more, we focused a bit more in Europe on how TSO and DSO interact and what should be brought at European level for discussion and as a guidance. In the last decade, Europe has very much focused on what we call horizontal integration, meaning cross-border exchange and TSO-TSO coordination. So how different countries exchange energy, get advantage of complementarity of generation resources in their countries. And now the focus shifts progressively to what we could call vertical integration, which is within one country, how the more global scale interact with the more local scale. So how small-scale generation assets, which are usually renewables and demand-side response assets, how these local assets will be integrated into the system locally, regionally, nationally, and finally cross-border, and how these very local assets and small scale could also contribute to the integrated European market. And this is the focus of the TSO-DSO dialogue in Europe lately. Here, the graph you can see comes from the International Energy Agency, which make an energy outlook every year. And this graph, we chose it because we found it very interesting on the flexibility needs by region in the world. On the horizontal scale, you will have the renewable generation share. So from left to right, an increasing renewable integration into the system. And on the vertical scale, from top to bottom to top, you have the flexibility needs. So when the arrows is growing, it means that the region or the country has an increasing need for flexibility in order to cope with an increasing share of renewable generation. So you can see that Germany, but also Denmark, for example, have important flexibility needs because they have important renewable integration. So the need for flexibility service is really there in order to integrate more renewable energy. So who would provide this flexibility potential? Here on this slide, you have the detail of which actors are actually providing this flexibility, which are so important to integrate renewables. And from you can see on the top of the slides what I called more horizontal integration in the introduction, meaning it's interconnectors which were firstly the main source of flexibility in the European power system. And you also had in the focus in the last decade the big generators such as pumped hydro, which are flexible, or quite big flexible generation. And nowadays the shift is towards a more local scale with battery storage, which could also come from small-scale batteries such as EV, demand response, virtual power plants, which will be new assets providing flexibility at a very local level, and aggregated together they can deliver quite important volume of flexibility. So this results to a shift of flexibility providers from the transmission side towards the distribution side. It doesn't mean that flexibility providers will not be connected to transmission side at all in the future, not at all, but we will have flexibility service provider connected through the whole electricity network from transmission to distribution. And it means that we have to rethink a bit how our markets are built today, and how markets can also integrate these small scale and local assets in order to allow any customer of the grid to provide flexibility services and to contribute to the integration of renewables. What do we mean when we speak about flexibility services? What is the focus here? Mainly, we sorted out the flexibility services in three main categories. The market one, which is the wholesale trade, we know, which happens from forward to day ahead until intraday timeframes. So basically the organized power exchanges. And then you have two other types of services which are growing in terms of needs to integrate renewables. It's what we call grid and system services. Grid services would be all the non-frequency ancillary services, for example, to maintain voltage, and will be, very importantly, services to manage the congestions, so to be sure that the active power flows in the lines would fit and respect the maximum limits of each power line. And the system services, which are the balancing services needed to maintain the balance between consumption and generation and to maintain the frequency of the system at the set frequency. So we focused in Europe on the grid and system services, and why are they evolving? For TSO, you can see on the bottom of this slide how TSO balancing services are evolving. Before, maybe around 10 to 100 units were participating to balancing. It was a bigger one. And today, the trend is that more and more units will participate to balancing, including very small-scale generation. So any kind of unit, generation unit, but also storage or demand side response unit could participate to balancing, and it changes a bit how this market mechanism should be done and operated. And on the bottom of the slide, you see how DSOs needs are changing. Indeed, DSOs are connecting more and more renewables, facing flexible demands, which means that congestion will be very fluctuating and very much increasing in DSO grids, creating needs for additional grid services. And these two questions bring us to a dialogue in Europe between TSO and DSO on how to foster these grid and system services, first point, and second point, how to best coordinate them, because the same asset could very much provide a grid service or a system service to the TSO or to the DSO, probably on the same time frame. So that's why we came to a discussion on active system management and what is it for European TSOs and DSOs. Here you have the front page of a report we published last month, which we called Integrated Approach to Active System Management, where ENTSO-E, so the TSO Association in Europe, together with the DSOs Association in Europe, shared and established a vision on what is active system management and how to best cooperate, focusing on the interaction between congestion management and balancing. So focusing on this grid and system services, how to procure them, how to foster them, and how to settle them. So here you have the detailed definition of active system management. I'll not read it through now, but basically it's a key set of strategy and tools that would be at the hand of DSOs and TSOs to manage the system in an active way and to be able to cope with an increasing share of renewable into the system. And we had as a starting point, let's say a basis principle, which is what we call an integrated system approach. It doesn't mean that the system is fully centralized. The trend towards decentralization is very clear. However, it means that the system should still be seen with a holistic view, and that all the actors should be taken into account and for the different services that they deliver and to the different scales. And it comes back a bit to the introduction I made. We have to keep in mind this horizontal integration between countries that we built during the last decade in Europe, but also go more towards vertical integration within the countries to really integrate the local scale into the system and the integrated market. And in this, what we called one system approach, we think that TSO and DSO's role and responsibility should be recognized, of course, as system operators, but also and importantly as market facilitator. What does it mean for a system operator to be market facilitators? It means that both TSOs and DSOs should ensure an efficient level playing field for market parties wherever they are, whatever their size is, from small to big, and should foster these new services and buy them from these actors in a market-based way. And for this, TSO-DSO coordination on mutual processes, on data exchange between them and with market parties is an absolute key in this process.
All right, thanks, Mathilde. I will continue from here. So just to follow the storyline that Mathilde has just been discussing, we see that TSOs and DSOs have something like that we call a toolbox, where we can use the flexibility potential beyond the network reinforcement, so this active system management. And the focus of the report that Mathilde was just discussing is on the market-based solutions. However, the toolbox is broader than that. So we also have technical solutions. We can make some topology changes. We can have connection agreements. So many things that are there, but the main focus is on this market-based solutions. So I will deep dive a bit further into that. First of all, as Mathilde already described, there are several markets. So you have the wholesale markets, you have the balancing markets, which is on frequency or on the system. Then there are ancillary services and congestion management, which will be on the grid side. And you can have capacity mechanisms, which certain countries already have in Europe. And to make sure that the customer can actually be present in all those markets if they want to. So we have several services that we need to define, and we have to ensure that the customer can actively participate in these markets. So this is something that also for TSOs and DSOs is something we really need to focus on. What kind of products do we need and how to define them? So to focus specifically on the congestion management process, we came up with a nice process to describe in different blocks what is needed. So first of all, we talk about the flexibility service provider, which can be an aggregator. It can be one of the larger parties that we already know today. It can even be the household customer on his own. So anyone that wants to provide any flexibility service is there. But to be able to provide this for congestion management towards a TSO or a DSO, they need to be pre-qualified. So we have two steps of pre-qualification. One is the product pre-qualification, which is mainly focused on can the asset itself technically deliver the product. And the grid pre-qualification is where the grid can actually make sure that this product, once delivered, can also be delivered from A to B. The information on this, so on the different kinds of flexibilities available and their pre-qualification and for which products, we come up with a flexibility register where we can have some kind of information sharing from the market towards TSOs and DSOs. Mostly static information, but it can even be broadened on member state level depending on what is required. So once this pre-qualification is done, the flexibility service provider can place a bid. And there are some market coordination schemes, which I will discuss in a bit more detail later, to ensure that this bid can actually be used. Because the idea is that TSOs and DSOs are not allowed to activate a bid that will cause another congestion in someone else's grid. So it's really a co-optimization and a coordination from all system operators working together. And once the bid, once it should be activated, of course the product should be activated, the flexibility service provider gets the information, the product is delivered, and the settlement can be done. So that is basically the process that we described, and also the process we used for the further discussions. And to go a bit more into detail on this market coordination scheme, we came up with 3 different options. So TSOs and DSOs agreed that there are 3 different options that can be chosen. Of course, depending on member state level, so it's not something pushed on a European level, but at least we came up with 3 options rather than a lot. On the left, you can see full separation. So in the red dotted box, you see the DSO congestion management, which remains on the DSO side, and then you have the balancing market and the TSO congestion management, also 2 separate blocks that remain on the TSO side. All the way on the right, so option 3, you see that all those 3 things are combined. So you have coordination schemes from balancing market and congestion management for both the TSO and DSO. In case you would like to have more like a middle option, you can go for option 2, where the balancing market remains by itself, and then the congestion management is combined for TSOs and DSOs. And these are things that we already see happening. So if we go to what's really happening already, and then our focus remains Europe. And so we made a mapping where you can see also the focus on TSO-DSO coordination. We see many pilots and products going on, as you can see on this map. You have to know that the position of the icon is illustrative. That means that, for example, if it's in the middle of a country, doesn't mean it's actually in the middle of the country, but it can be anywhere or in different parts of the country. So what we saw different kinds of categories. We came up with the flexibility marketplaces, which are the orange icons. We see many things happening on data exchange, so the blue icons, and also technical solutions, where you really focus on grid solutions on TSOs and DSO side, which are the purple ones. And something that we didn't map, but is very present in Europe is the number of aggregators. And aggregators are active in different fields and also all over Europe. So since it covers all Europe, we didn't map them in this picture, but it's something that we need to say that that's really there. So to explain a little bit on what kind of projects we have been doing. So the 4 categories you can see on the top of this slide, and you see that there are many different projects that we try to map. And also, for example, if you look at the flexibility marketplaces in orange, we see that this can be operated by a TSO, by a DSO. Sometimes even they do it jointly. It can be also operated by a power exchange. And in some cases, it's even a third party or through blockchain methods. So looking at this slide, and I will not go into all the details of it, you can really see that many projects are ongoing in Europe. Many things are being piloted and test cased. And it's very interesting to keep track of the outcomes of all these projects to see where Europe eventually is going. One thing that we also discussed in this active system management report is the implementation of the market models that I just described. And there are several platform options that we see. Most important is to, at least in Europe, the discussion of the commercial domain, which is really focused on basically earning money. So all the market parties are in the commercial domain. And on the right side, you can see the regulated domain, which is regulated business done by TSOs and DSOs. So there should be a very clear cut between those different domains. However, from left to right, so we see first the flexibility asset. This can be aggregated, and then the bids can go to a certain marketplace where there can be a matching between sellers and buyers. On the right-hand side, you see that the TSO and DSO have needs, and they can buy either on their own or in coordination. So the dotted line shows that this marketplace can either be in a commercial domain, in a regulated domain, or a combination. The combination here means mostly that the product can be a regulated product, so for example, congestion management, but it's being delivered from the commercial domain, so any flexibility service provider that can provide it. And then the owner of this marketplace can be either the TSO or the DSO. It can be a third party. It can be a power exchange. So many options, and that's why this dotted line is also crossing the marketplace. And well, one of the things that we discussed, so the flexibility marketplaces category, we try to show also the scale. So what you can see is the pink one is the local scale, the purple one the national scale, and the blue one is the regional or cross-country or cross-border scale. And you can see that all the scales are present in Europe. And also what you can see is that there are several ones where a TSO is in charge, other ones where a DSO is in charge, a combination of TSO and DSO, the power exchange, or a third party. So it's very interesting to see that there are many different options possible, and everything is being tested. And our main focus, I mean, we try to obviously check all the different projects. However, it's not exhaustive. So we're trying to keep this mapping alive, but obviously we don't have everything. However, it gives a very clear view of where we're going in Europe, and it will help us also in combining the top-down approach that we had with the guiding principles from the Active System Management Report with the bottom-up approach to really see what is being piloted and what's coming out of it, what are the results. So here I will hand over to Jens. So go ahead.
So I think Jens may have been waylaid. So this is Eamonn again. I'm going to take this part in his absence. Maybe to kind of move from the operational time frame and understanding how the flexibility gets untapped and used in operations to looking at more of the planning focused issues in the US. The one that you'll be most familiar with, perhaps all around, and maybe initially you don't necessarily feel this is a TSO-DSO outright thing, but I think there's a strong case to be made that the new IEEE standard 1547, the 2018 version that came through last year, that I'm sure you've all heard about, that's really the crux of the issue when it comes to planning for a safe, reliable, secure system into the future where you have all this DER on the system. So be it either an actual service that you provide or an involvement in the market, the ability to communicate and report a dispatch set point or production, those things are all enablers to be able to make sure that DER can be integrated into market operations or balancing or those things, as much as the provisions to ensure that DER have right through, can provide the other services required to make sure that system islanding isn't an issue, whatever else. So those are distribution issues, but they're also transmission issues. And IEEE 1547 gives us a kind of a template to be able to specify what it is that we want from DER within a kind of a tighter set of categories, but fairly wide ranging. But it's born from an understanding that DER in isolation are no longer DER in isolation, that they can have systemic effects. So a transmission fault can depress voltage, and then that in turn can cause loss of DER generation, which in turn then which is an issue for both the distribution system as well as then a much bigger issue for the transmission system, because there's a kind of maybe a split there between the boundaries of where the codes were. So that discussion that took place through the 1547 standards working group, and now as it goes to adoption in various areas around the US in particular, but elsewhere as well, that's really a valuable starting point for the discussion between practitioners in the transmission level and the distribution level to understand each other. So while there is a kind of there is different objectives that are there on the distribution side from the transmission side. Transmission having a couple of extra responsibilities in terms of reliability, distribution having a lot more in terms of assets and a lot more in terms of field crews out there and considerations that have to be made in that regard. The issue is to come to a common understanding, and that happens through the standards working groups and processes initially, but now it really comes down to practice. And as the standards start to become requirements, specifying those requirements for specific regions will be a collaborative process to best resolve this tension between the two needs. And it also then helps when issues do arise to be able to understand why and how changes can be made to DER. So we also know that the consequence of not talking, particularly at this stage in the planning time frame, as connection codes are being written, is that missettings are put on DER. A lot of them get built out on the system, and then several years later, or maybe even more immediately, you kind of just discover a problem that requires remediation, and those remediations are quite expensive, even if no event occurs on the system. So it is really quite important, and it's kind of an understated aspect of the whole DER integration discussion, but really one of the most important parts of it is that transmission side engineers and other participants in the transmission side and the distribution side practitioners and DER vendors have very reliable, very good conversations, build up the relationships to be able to call on as the system evolves, because that's the thing that's going to motivate and also to catalyze action when it's needed. So the standards are obviously very important, but as important, the point I'm making is the relationships and the understanding that's starting to grow across the transmission distribution boundary. And if that's not happening in your area, or you feel that it's maybe underserved in your area, it's a really, really good first step to just get people in the room to talk about these issues. Some of you will be sick to death of talking to each other about them, so it depends on where you are. In relation to 1547 and how that helps point the conversation across the T and D boundary in a planning sense, there's lots of choices yet to be made on how it gets implemented in different systems in terms of the actual parameters and limits themselves and categorization. So some of the things that are happening right now are initiatives across ISO New England through the Massachusetts Standards Review Group, using existing standards where they are for the testing, from a testing point of view, just to try and get momentum built up to pave the way to be able to use 1547 in future as a DER connection standard. So that process is underway. That's a collaborative process across the boundary and builds understanding, which will really help to kind of push on that discussion there. Then similarly in PJM, there's been some activities there and workshops, DER right through focus, to be able to bring those parties together to discuss the planning level concerns, and then trying to work towards implementation, adoption of IEEE 1547 in early 2020. This is all important because the remaining apparatus around 1547 and also the vendors' implementation of those of the capabilities required by that standard are expected to come around by 2021. So, there's still a couple of years between now and then. There's still a lot of DER that will go in between now and then. So really, it's very important that discussion gets kind of thorough. It's done in a collaborative manner, and it's done kind of with speed, because we see the speed at which the system is changing in not just some regions, but a lot of regions. I'm just going to, in the interest of time, to leave some room to talk at the end, move from the 1547 planning time frame domain into a quick discussion about things that are happening in markets. So we see that Order 841, some of you don't know, FERC order number is off by heart, look at you. So that was a storage order that was put out a couple of years ago, or 2017. That creates the opportunity for demand, for not just storage on the demand, on the distribution side, but also potentially other resources to bid into the market, into the ISO markets with asset sizes down to 100 kilowatts. So we're very firmly in the DER range there. We're starting to see other initiatives, some of these are well established at this stage. So the distributed energy resource provider, and then the demand response programs that have been in place in California offer an ability for DER to find market, but in somewhat of a constrained way. Order 841 and the follow-on that may come from that will give a different access to DER into the market that might not be, that isn't there right now. That has some interesting questions for what happens on the distribution system. How do people get qualification to partake in those wholesale markets? Maybe congestion on the distribution system isn't as big an issue in the US right now as it is in Europe, but it's a substantial issue that will continue to get to emerge. So those questions need to be worked towards as DER not just enter those markets, but become a more of a mainstay player in those markets. Not just in California. Here we also show that ERCOT have been working on it for a long time through the DREAM working group, and then now offering DER the opportunity to take locational marginal prices in that system. So slowly, bit by bit, additions are being made, decisions being made on the transmission system or in markets that will have impacts on the transmission system and on the distribution system, and there's a collegiate approach needed to be able to heed any sort of induced issues off as they arise. As I say, there's a bit of a way to go before that is an issue in a lot of places, but it's a conversation worth having. Similarly, there's the ongoing work in New York around the REV that will pave a similar path. One final thing before we get to questions, and I hope if you have questions that you've been having a chance to put them in the chat and the Q&A, I see a couple coming in. If not, now's your time. But just a quick information that we run an interest group around DERMS and DER aggregation group management. It's a kind of invitation, but there's a wide-ranging invitation if you'd like to join that group. It runs every week. It goes through what DERMS capabilities are, and really is trying to inform how those standards for what a DERMS is gets to inform that process. But it's also very informational. I've been on several of those calls myself, hearing from others the use cases they're considering for DERMS, how that may differ from region to region, and yet how common the messages that need to be passed from one actor to another, from transmission to distribution, distribution to an aggregator, or and an aggregator maybe onto an actual individual DER resource. So it's a great conversation to be part of, and if you can join, there's an email address there. We'll be happy to hear from you. So other than that, I think, Jay, we're going to finish up here on this slide, and then maybe you'll take over. But so some big challenges to think about as we put together the T&D interface in a more holistic way. Thinking about data management, where the data is originating, how it's going to get to the end consumer, and making sure that process does happen, because the system reliability that's often at stake. Most of the time it comes down to metering and how well we have things metered. So metering policy is really, really fundamental to how things work. That's normally in the remit of a distribution utility. It can have wide-ranging repercussions depending on what services they may want to provide in future up to the transmission system. How to manage that interaction between clearing or managing congestion on a distribution system, on a transmission system, and balancing where it's megawatts up, megawatts down, but for different purposes. Those are real on live issues that we're trying to work towards together, and hopefully that in each region we can kind of work that out. And finally, all of this is being driven by consumer behavior. Consumers putting PV on the roof, consumers buying an electric car, changing their energy supplier, whatever else. Building a better understanding of how consumers are behaving or are likely to behave in the future to inform what we're doing in planning for distribution transmission systems as well as in operations is really fundamental underpinning, and it's not something that we as utilities know all that well right now. So it's a big issue that we can have a discussion around. So hopefully there's some questions in there that you can, or some issues in there that you can hang your hat on and ask us about. But Jay, maybe I'll pass it over to you. So.
Thanks, Eamonn. You and Mathilde and as well as Erda did a great job. Before we get into, there is a few questions that I will ask on behalf of the participants, but before I do that, do any of the panelists have any clarifying remarks that they want to make before we get into the Q&A?
Hey, this is Jens Böhmer. I joined a little bit late. I apologize for that, but if there are any questions with regard to the T&D coordination on planning, I'll be available in the next 10-20 minutes to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Jens. I appreciate that. We did have some chat as well as there was at least one question put in the Q&A box. Please add them if you can, but I'll get them started if you don't mind, and I'll throw this out to any of the panelists. It's a very technical question. Can power oscillation damping be provided by PV plants, PV STATCOM plants, be considered a flexibility service to enhance system stability? Does anybody want to comment on that?
Well, maybe, I mean, I don't have much to say since I'm not very into the details there. Obviously, I mean, it sounds like it could, but yeah, I've been more into the active power management rather than really into other system stability issues. So I don't know, Eamonn, if you have any.
Yeah, there's probably others on the call that are better qualified to answer this than I am, but sure, that's never stopped me before. I would say that whether it's a flexibility service or not is really kind of up to the regional specific discussion. Flexibility means different things to different people. Typically, it's kind of meant in the balancing, intraday, day ahead, energy markets kind of sense, and then maybe also in the kind of longer run ancillary services. In Europe, manual frequency restoration reserve and replacement reserve. In the US, kind of non-spin ink deck type reserve. So that's kind of my understanding as best I can do around what flexibility is. Not to say that there are non-megawatt flexibility services. There may be, in some systems, the Irish system, there's now a kind of dynamic reactive product being introduced. So yeah, there are non-active power ancillary services. Whether they're flexibility or not is a different question. On the specific issue of PV STATCOM, I would probably say that it probably depends on where it is. If it's up on the transmission system, maybe more useful than buried somewhere down in the distribution system. But there's a lot of, technically maybe that might be an ancillary service that one system might need, but that the asset would have to be in the right place for that. But I don't know. Jens might have a better an alternative way of thinking about it.
Hey, this is Jens. I think it rather brings us to a more fundamental question in terms of should we think of ancillary services the same way that we've thought of them in the past, where it's a couple of large-scale generators providing them? And should we bound our thinking by what we are used from the past, or should we look for the opportunities, technical opportunities of new inverter-based and distributed generation, and let that drive potential future products? Everything really remains to be seen. It all comes down to the needs, and I'm pretty sure each region will come up with their own set of services. So I think technically, of course, it may be possible, but whether it's effective and required is a completely different question.
Thank you, everybody. That was great. We've got several questions, and we're probably not going to be able to get to them. I do want to throw out one more right now. It's being asked, the efforts that we're talking about here seem to be focusing almost exclusively on real power issues, on congestion and pricing and things like that. That's a comment, but the question is, so what's being done on the reactive power flow or voltage front? Is that being addressed anywhere?
On the European level, I would say it's mostly in the member states. So Europe-wide, not that much. It's still on the work plan between TSOs and DSOs. So it's more, I think, individual TSOs and individual DSOs working on that. What exactly they do, I don't know. But especially in a TSO-DSO interface, I think it's not much more than agreement on keeping the voltage in a specific in between specific limits.
Indeed, this is a good question, because in the TSO-DSO cooperation, this topic comes back a lot. Indeed, it's very local, so we don't have rules at European level for this. But we saw when we did the mapping that Gerda presented about the different local pilot projects we have in Europe on TSO-DSO interactions. There are indeed a few on voltage control and how TSO and DSO develop solutions. So it could be a technical, and sometimes it's even they try to build a market for it when they think there is a case, because renewables generation indeed create voltage constraints, but can also provide solutions for it. And usually it's a topic where TSO-DSO coordination is a bit smoother than for active power, because they manage to speak between each other in a smoother way, and the issues are very local and very a bit easier to identify.
Thanks, Mathilde and Erda. That's great. One last question, and then we're going to wrap this up. Cheap computing enables automated distribution system decisions without direct control by the utility or the aggregator, and only requires appropriate incentives, primarily pricing. Why is there still so much focus on aggregators and direct control systems? Who wants to tackle that?
So I'll go first, maybe, but I wouldn't say, I would say things are getting more decentralized than they were before. Ultimately, I guess the philosophy in Europe is that there's one single market for energy from days ahead down to real time, or pretty close to real time, and that market clearing will happen through that. Whether it's a small aggregator or a single resource that wants to bid into that, or if it's a collection, I think that's really a question of how the economics work out for the aggregator. We tend to know that bigger aggregators want to be bigger and have more assets and play a bigger part in the market. It maybe gets a little bit easier in terms of trying to contract with those aggregators over longer terms to hedge risks. In the US, the ISO markets will come up with whatever rules that they end up coming up with, but the 100 kilowatt rule is pretty small. So it's a question of, can we just let everybody discover the price themselves through peer-to-peer trading, and somehow the congestion management will work out? Maybe that's the case, but the incremental steps from centralized markets to try and build in DER and then work out the local issues on a more local basis, probably the path that it's going to materialize first. Not to say that it's the only way to do it. It's just that it's probably the path that people will most readily accept right now.
Thanks, Eamonn. Go ahead.
In Europe, I think it's also mainly focused on doing many things in a market-based way rather than regulated. So, I mean, if you really look at pricing, you need to either change your market design or have a specific kind of regulation for tariffication. So I think the main focus in Europe is on aggregators, especially because of this market-based approach. And also the automated things that can happen is usually on the aggregator side and not that much on the TSO or DSO side. So I think that's also one of the reasons why the focus is more on aggregators.
Thanks, Erda. That's great. Hey, we're at the bottom of the hour, and we need to wrap this up. As I mentioned earlier, an email will go out once the presentation and the audio file have been posted, and we will be posting the responses to any unanswered questions as soon as they're ready. We appreciate your engagement. Look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be at noon Eastern Time on June 19th. That webinar will feature a topic of transmission topology optimization for congestion management, presented by Pablo Ruiz of Brattle and myself with Southwest Power Pool. This is a very timely topic, both domestically and internationally, given the proliferation of renewable energy and its impact on the transmission system. So I hope you'll be able to join us. For further information on all our webinars and meetings, you can find them at the website, www.esig.energy, under events, and in our newsletters and informational emails. Eamonn, Jans, Mathilde, and Herta, I want to thank you again for this very timely and informative webinar, and thank all of you for your participation and questions. We look forward to seeing many of you at the Forecasting and Markets Workshop in Denver in June or next month with Pablo and myself on congestion management. In the meantime, take care, everyone, and thanks again. Goodbye.
Bye, thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Great job, guys. It went pretty smooth.
I thought so too. Everybody did a great job on getting through their slides, and we had a couple good questions. There's still another 3 or 4 questions we need to probably answer, but
okay. Do you want me to
how do you want to do that?
get those down somewhere?
Can you do that, Ryan? Cut and paste them and send them around maybe, and we can figure out how to best address them, and you can coordinate that for us?
No problem.
Sorry we went over a minute or so, but I didn't want to cut off the conversation.